The Galactic Council's emergency session hall buzzed with the kind of nervous energy typically reserved for impending apocalypses and tax audits. Representatives from 47 species clustered around holographic displays, showing what could only be described as the universe's most adorable death sentence. "The Kytherian cubs are surrounded," announced Ambassador Velthar, his crystalline voice structure vibrating with barely contained panic. "The Shadowhunter pack has them cornered in the sacred grove of eternal whispers. If those cubs die, the Kytherian Empire will declare war on the entire Andromeda sector." The assembled delegates erupted into chaos. The Zephyrians began their traditional death wails, the mechanoids started calculating casualty projections, and the Florians were already composting themselves in preparation for the coming destruction. "Silence!" The Council Prime's tentacles slammed against the podium with the force of a small earthquake. "We have exactly 47 standard hours before the Kytherian fleet arrives. Every rescue attempt has failed. The Shadowhunters are too cunning, too vicious. They've anticipated every military strategy, every diplomatic overture, every—" "Excuse me," interrupted a thoroughly unremarkable voice from the back of the chamber. Every eye, sensor, and psychic tendril turned toward the source of the interruption. There, sitting in the designated Primitive Species Observer section, was a human. Not just any human, but the kind of aggressively ordinary human that made bureaucrats everywhere feel slightly better about their life choices. Dr. Patricia Williams, veterinarian, part-time substitute teacher, and full-time skeptic of anything that couldn't be fixed with common sense or a good night's sleep, raised her hand like she was asking permission to use the bathroom. "I'm sorry, but did you say cubs? Like baby animals?" she asked, consulting the translation device clipped to her ear with the same expression she usually reserved for clients who insisted their perfectly healthy dogs were dying of exotic diseases. The silence that followed was the kind of silence usually associated with black holes and very awkward first dates. Ambassador Velthar's crystalline structure flickered through several shades of confused. The Kytherian offspring are indeed in their juvenile state. Yes. But these are not mere animals, human. The Kytherians are a proud warrior race with psychic capabilities that can— "Right. But they're still babies," Patricia interrupted, pulling out what appeared to be a standard Earth tablet and stylus. "Surrounded by predators. In a forest. And you've tried— what exactly?" The mechanoid representative, Unit Designate Efficiency 7, projected a holographic display showing their failed rescue attempts. Military insertion, repelled, stealth infiltration, detected, aerial extraction, intercepted, diplomatic negotiation, resulted in the consumption of 3 ambassadors. Patricia squinted at the hologram like she was reading a particularly confusing veterinary chart. "And these Shadowhunters, they're pack hunters?" "The most feared predators in the galaxy," confirmed the Florian delegate, whose leaves were already turning autumn colors in anticipation of galactic doom. "They hunt in coordinated groups, using advanced tactical—" "So, they're basically wolves," Patricia said, making a note on her tablet. "With the cubs trapped in the middle, and you've been trying to fight your way through the pack." The assembled delegates exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both condescension and growing unease. Here was this primitive biped from a planet so backward they still used combustion engines, and she was treating their greatest crisis like a routine Tuesday. "Human." The Council Prime's voice carried the weight of barely restrained exasperation. "The Shadowhunters have evolved beyond simple pack behavior. They possess intelligence, strategy, weapons technology. But they're still protecting territory and cubs, right?" Patricia continued, completely ignoring the mounting tension in the room. "Look, I've been dealing with protective animal behavior for 15 years. You don't fight through a pack defending young. You either wait them out, or—" She paused, studying the hologram with the same intensity she usually reserved for particularly challenging surgical procedures. "Or what, human?" Ambassador Velthar's crystalline voice cracked slightly. Patricia looked up from her tablet, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she smiled. It wasn't a particularly reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile worn by someone who had just realized that the entire galaxy was populated by very intelligent beings who had somehow missed the most obvious solution in the universe. Or you send in someone they don't see as a threat, she said simply. Someone who speaks their language. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. The Zephyrians' death wails reached a new octave. The mechanoids began recalculating everything, and somewhere in the back, a Florian delegate actually began photosynthesizing from pure anxiety. Council Prime's tentacles writhed in what Patricia was beginning to recognize as the galactic equivalent of a stress headache. Human. The Shadowhunters have rejected every diplomatic overture. They communicate through complex pheromone patterns and psychic resonance fields that— They're mammals, aren't they? Patricia interrupted, already standing up and shouldering what appeared to be a standard Earth backpack. Warm-blooded, live births, nurse their young? Well, yes, but then they'll understand me just fine. Patricia was already heading toward the chamber exit, leaving behind a room full of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, staring after her in various states of confusion and dawning horror. Wait! Ambassador Velthar's voice reached frequencies that made several species' ears bleed. You cannot simply walk into the sacred grove. The Shadowhunters will tear you apart. You're just one small, soft, defenseless— Patricia paused at the exit, her hand on the door controls. When she turned back, her expression had shifted from mild amusement to something that made several delegates instinctively step backward. Defenseless, she repeated, and her voice carried the kind of quiet confidence that came from someone who had spent years dealing with frightened, aggressive animals and the even more frightened, aggressive people who owned them. You really don't know anything about humans, do you? The door slid shut behind her, leaving the Galactic Council's emergency session hall in the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for natural disasters and really bad poetry readings. In the distance, alarms began to sound as Patricia Williams, DVM, requested immediate transport to the sacred grove of Eternal Whispers, where the most feared predators in the galaxy waited with the fate of interstellar peace literally in their jaws. The sacred grove of Eternal Whispers was the kind of place that made travel brochures use words like mystical and soul-stirring, usually followed by fine print about liability waivers and next-of-kin notification procedures. Ancient trees stretched toward a purple sky, their bioluminescent bark casting ethereal shadows that danced with otherworldly beauty. It would have been absolutely breathtaking if not for the small matter of the dozen Shadowhunters currently demonstrating why they were considered the galaxy's apex predators. Patricia Williams stood at the forest's edge, watching the standoff through a pair of standard Earth binoculars, while the entire Galactic Defense Fleet maintained what they generously called a strategic perimeter, and what she recognized as hiding behind really big rocks. The human has arrived at the perimeter, reported Fleet Commander Zexthul through the comm system. She appears to be observing the situation. Any signs of advanced weaponry? Asked Ambassador Velthar from the safety of his command ship. Negative. She carries what appears to be a primitive carrying container and some form of optical enhancement device. Patricia lowered her binoculars and opened her backpack, pulling out items that made the watching aliens question everything they thought they knew about human technology. A thermos, some sandwiches, a worn paperback novel, and what appeared to be a collection of small, colorful objects. Are those toys? Whispered the mechanoid observer, his sensors struggling to classify the rubber balls and squeaky objects. Unknown, replied the fleet commander. She's sitting down, on the ground. She appears to be eating. This was not, Patricia reflected while unwrapping her lunch, how she'd planned to spend her vacation. The Galactic Council had invited her as part of their primitive species cultural exchange program, which she was beginning to suspect was less about cultural exchange and more about having someone around to blame when things went horribly wrong. The Shadowhunters were magnificent creatures, she had to admit. Each stood roughly 8 feet tall, with sleek black fur that seemed to absorb light, intelligent amber eyes, and enough teeth to make a shark feel inadequate. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, maintaining perfect formation around the small clearing where 3 Kytherian cubs huddled together. The cubs themselves were adorable in the way that all baby animals were adorable, even when they belonged to species capable of leveling small planets with their minds. They looked like a cross between lion cubs and small dragons, with iridescent scales that shifted from blue to gold and tiny wings that weren't quite ready for flight. Patricia finished her sandwich, stood up, and began walking toward the forest. "The human is approaching the perimeter." Fleet Commander Zexthel's voice cracked with panic. "Should we intervene?" "Negative," came Ambassador Velthar's reply, though he sounded like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. The human insisted on no interference. "We must observe." The first Shadowhunter noticed Patricia when she was still 50 meters away. Its head snapped up, ears forward, and a low growl that sounded like distant thunder rolled through the forest. The rest of the pack immediately shifted position, creating a wall of fangs and fury between the approaching human and their protected cubs. Patricia stopped walking and sat down again, this time cross-legged in the dirt. She pulled out her thermos, poured herself a cup of coffee, and waited. "What is she doing?" Ambassador Velthar demanded. "Drinking a hot beverage," reported the fleet commander. "And waiting." The lead Shadowhunter took 3 steps forward, its growl deepening to a frequency that made the monitoring equipment vibrate. Patricia sipped her coffee and checked her watch like she was waiting for a bus. Minutes passed. The Shadowhunter's growl gradually faded to confused silence. This was not how threats typically behaved. Threats ran, or fought, or at least had the courtesy to show proper fear. They didn't sit in the dirt drinking coffee and occasionally checking their timekeeping devices. Patricia finished her coffee, screwed the cap back on her thermos, and began to speak. "Easy there, big guy," she said in the same tone she used with nervous dogs at her clinic. "Nobody's here to hurt anyone. I can see you've got babies to protect, and you're doing a good job. Really good job." The Shadowhunter's ears twitched. Its packmates shifted nervously, unused to prey that made calm, reassuring sounds instead of screaming. "Those are some beautiful cubs you're watching over," Patricia continued, slowly reaching into her backpack. "I bet their parents are worried sick. You know how parents get." She pulled out one of the rubber balls, bright red and perfectly ordinary by Earth standards. To the watching aliens, it appeared to be some form of advanced technology, possibly a weapon or communication device. Patricia squeezed the ball. It squeaked. The effect on the Shadowhunters was immediate and profound. 12 apex predators, each capable of tearing through battle armor with their bare claws, suddenly looked like confused puppies. Ears perked up, heads tilted, and several of them took involuntary steps forward. "Oh, you like that, do you?" Patricia squeezed the ball again, producing another squeak. "Yeah, I thought you might." She tossed the ball gently to the side. The lead Shadowhunter's eyes tracked its movement with laser focus, and for a moment Patricia could see the internal struggle between predatory instinct and pack discipline. Pack discipline won, but it was a close thing. "Fleet Commander," Ambassador Velthar's voice was barely a whisper. "What is the human doing?" I believe she's playing with them, sir." Patricia pulled out a second toy, this one a rope with knots at both ends. She gave it a shake, making it wiggle enticingly. 3 Shadowhunters took unconscious steps forward before catching themselves. "You're all very good dogs," Patricia said conversationally. "Yes, you are. Very good dogs protecting your babies." The Shadowhunters exchanged glances that somehow conveyed both confusion and a growing sense that perhaps they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. The human wasn't acting like prey. She wasn't acting like a predator either. She was acting like a pack member. An adult pack member who had brought toys and was clearly here to help with the cubs. The lead Shadowhunter took another step forward, then another. Its growl had faded entirely, replaced by a low whining sound that Patricia recognized immediately. "That's right," she said softly. "You're doing such a good job, but you're tired, aren't you? Been standing guard for hours. That's hard work." She pulled out a third toy, a tennis ball, worn from years of use. Without warning, she threw it directly at the lead Shadowhunter. Every weapon in the Galactic Defense Fleet powered up simultaneously. This was it. The human had finally made her fatal mistake. The Shadowhunter would tear her apart, the cubs would die, and the galaxy would burn. The lead Shadowhunter caught the tennis ball in its mouth. For a moment, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, almost sheepishly, the most feared predator in the galaxy brought the ball back to Patricia and dropped it at her feet, tail wagging. "Good boy," Patricia said, scratching behind his ears. "Very good boy." The Galactic Defense Fleet's command center had descended into the kind of chaos typically reserved for natural disasters, tax audits, and really bad cafeteria food. Every screen showed the same impossible scene. The galaxy's most feared predator pack playing fetch with a human veterinarian, while 3 Kytherian cubs watched with what could only be described as profound confusion. "This is impossible," Ambassador Velthar muttered, his crystalline structure flickering through colors that didn't have names in any known language. "The Shadowhunters are apex predators. They don't play." "Apparently they do," replied Fleet Commander Zexthul, watching as Patricia threw a rope toy for the 3rd time, while 4 Shadowhunters competed to retrieve it. "The human appears to have established some form of pack hierarchy." Down in the sacred grove, Patricia was discovering that the universe's most terrifying predators had a lot in common with the dogs she treated back home. They were intelligent, fiercely protective, and absolutely desperate for someone to tell them they were good boys. "Yes, you brought it back. Good job," she said, accepting the slobber-covered rope from a Shadowhunter who was practically vibrating with excitement. "And you, with the pretty eyes, you want a turn too, don't you?" The Shadowhunter in question, a sleek female with distinctive amber markings, actually sat down and lifted a paw. Patricia blinked. Did you just shake hands with me?" The watching aliens were asking themselves the same question, though in significantly more panicked tones. "Fleet Commander," came a new voice over the comm system. "This is Science Vessel Probability's Edge. We're detecting unusual energy readings from the Grove." "What kind of energy readings?" "Well, sir, it appears to be joy. Pure, concentrated joy. The Shadowhunters are generating emotional resonance patterns consistent with extreme happiness." Patricia, unaware that she was apparently causing detectable levels of joy to radiate through space, had moved on to the next phase of her plan. She walked slowly toward the center of the clearing, where the 3 Kytherian cubs were still huddled together, watching the proceedings with wide, uncertain eyes. The Shadowhunters immediately tensed, forming a protective circle around her. But instead of threatening growls, they made soft whining sounds, as if asking permission. "It's okay," Patricia said softly. "I just want to check on the little ones. Make sure they're not hurt." She knelt down a few meters from the cubs, making herself smaller and less threatening. The cubs, who couldn't have been more than a few months old, looked at her with the universal expression of young animals everywhere. Curious, frightened, and desperately wanting someone to make everything okay. "Hey there, little ones," Patricia said in the same gentle voice she used with scared puppies. "You must be scared. Been a long day, hasn't it?" The smallest cub, barely the size of a house cat, made a soft chirping sound and took a tentative step forward. "That's it," Patricia encouraged. "Nobody's going to hurt you. These big guys here, they've been taking very good care of you." She reached into her backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a standard Earth protein bar. To the watching aliens, it looked like some form of advanced nutrition technology. "Are you hungry?" she asked, breaking off a small piece and offering it to the cubs. The smallest cub approached cautiously, sniffed the offering, and then gobbled it up with enthusiasm. Its siblings quickly followed suit, and within minutes, all 3 cubs were clustered around Patricia, chirping contentedly as she fed them pieces of what she privately thought of as the most expensive granola bar in galactic history. "Fleet Commander," the science vessel reported. "The joy readings are now off the charts. Also, we're detecting what appears to be gratitude. The Shadowhunters are expressing emotional patterns consistent with profound relief and appreciation." Indeed, the Shadowhunters were looking at Patricia with expressions that transcended species barriers. Here was someone who understood, someone who didn't see them as monsters or threats, but as what they really were, parents doing their best to protect children who weren't even their own species. Patricia stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and addressed the pack leader who had been the first to accept her ball-throwing expertise. "Okay, big guy, here's the situation," she said conversationally. "These little ones need to get home to their parents. Their real parents are probably worried sick, and if they don't get home soon, there's going to be a lot of trouble for everyone." The pack leader tilted his head, ears forward, listening intently. "Now, I know you've been doing a great job protecting them, but they're not your species. They need different food, different care. And their parents, well, their parents have some pretty big friends who are getting very worried." Patricia gestured toward the sky, where the lights of the Galactic Defense Fleet were visible even in daylight. "See those lights up there? Those are the little ones' family friends. They're not here to hurt anyone, but they're very, very worried. And when parents get worried about their babies," she let the sentence hang. Every parent in the galaxy, regardless of species, understood that particular threat. The pack leader looked at the cubs, then at the lights in the sky, then back at Patricia. Slowly, he walked over to the smallest cub and gently nudged it toward her. "That's right," Patricia said softly. "You know they need to go home. You're such a good boy, such a smart boy." One by one, the other Shadowhunters began nudging the cubs toward Patricia. It was clear they understood. This human was safe. This human was Pack. This human would take care of the little ones. Patricia gathered the cubs gently, surprised by how easily they came to her. They chirped and purred, tiny claws gripping her jacket as they settled against her warmth. "Fleet Commander," she said, tapping her comm device, "this is Dr. Williams. I'm ready for pickup, and I'm bringing some friends." The silence that followed was pregnant with the kind of disbelief usually reserved for miracle cures and lottery winnings. "Doctor, did you just... Are the cubs safe?" "Safe and sound," Patricia confirmed, scratching one cub behind its tiny ear ridges. "Though we're going to need to talk about proper interspecies childcare protocols. These little ones were scared, hungry, and desperately needed someone to tell them everything was going to be okay." She looked around at the Shadowhunters, who were watching her with expressions of profound respect and what appeared to be gratitude. "Also," she added, "we need to have a serious conversation about how this whole situation started. Because from what I can tell, these Shadowhunters weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to help." The pack leader approached her one more time, gently touching his nose to her hand in what was unmistakably a gesture of thanks. Then, with a series of low calls to his pack, he began leading them back into the deeper forest. "Wait," Patricia called after them. She pulled the tennis ball from her pocket and threw it one more time. "Good boys. All of you. Very good boys." The pack leader caught the ball, tail wagging, then disappeared into the shadows with his family. As the transport ship descended from the fleet above, Patricia looked down at the three cubs in her arms and shook her head. "You know what the really funny part is?" she said to them. "I bet nobody even asked what you were doing in that forest in the first place." The cubs chirped in what sounded remarkably like agreement. The Kytherian Imperial flagship Eternal Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace with the kind of dramatic flair typically reserved for opera finales and really expensive fireworks displays. Its arrival had been anticipated with the sort of dread usually associated with tax audits and family reunions, but instead of finding a war zone, they discovered something far more confusing. A peaceful fleet formation and what appeared to be an impromptu interspecies daycare center. Patricia Williams sat in the observation lounge of the Galactic Council flagship, watching three Kytherian cubs play with a collection of Earth toys while their parents, who had arrived expecting to declare war on half the galaxy, tried to process what they were seeing. "Let me understand this correctly," said Empress Kythera, her psychic voice resonating with barely contained confusion. "You played with the Shadowhunters?" "I wouldn't call it playing exactly," Patricia replied, sipping coffee from a mug that probably cost more than her annual salary. "More like communication. They were trying to protect your kids. They just didn't know how to tell anyone that." The Empress's scales shifted through several shades of bewildered purple. "The Shadowhunters are the most feared predators in 3 sectors. They do not communicate." "They communicate just fine," Patricia said mildly. You just have to speak their language, which, as it turns out, is pretty much universal among mammals. Protect the young, respect the pack hierarchy, and always, always bring toys. Ambassador Velthar's crystalline structure was flickering through what Patricia was beginning to recognize as his trying to process impossible information pattern. Dr. Williams, the implications of what you've accomplished. The Shadowhunters have never shown non-aggressive behavior toward any sentient species. Ever. That's because nobody ever tried treating them like people, Patricia pointed out. Look, I've been a veterinarian for 15 years. You know what I've learned? Doesn't matter if it's a scared chihuahua or an apex predator from another galaxy. If something is protecting young that aren't its own, there's usually a very good reason. She gestured toward the cubs, who were currently engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about the proper way to play with a squeaky toy. So I did some research while we were waiting for you to arrive, she continued. Turns out your cubs weren't kidnapped or attacked. They wandered off during a family camping trip, got lost in the forest, and the Shadowhunters found them first. Empress Kythera's psychic emanations suddenly shifted to what Patricia was learning to recognize as parental embarrassment. They wandered off? Kids do that, Patricia said with the tone of someone who had dealt with worried pet parents for over a decade. The Shadowhunters found 3 scared, hungry babies and did what any decent parent would do. They protected them, fed them, kept them warm, stood guard against anything that might hurt them. But why did they not simply return the cubs to us? Asked the Empress. Patricia looked at her with the expression she usually reserved for clients who asked why their cats couldn't just explain what was wrong with them. How exactly were they supposed to do that? Walk up to your military outposts carrying your children and hope nobody shot first and asked questions later? They're not stupid. They know how the galaxy sees them. So they did the next best thing. They found a safe place and waited for someone to come who would understand. The silence that followed was the kind of silence usually associated with profound realizations and really awkward family dinners. Fleet Commander Zexthal cleared his throat, or the mechanical equivalent. Dr. Williams, there is another matter we must discuss. The Shadowhunters' behavior toward you was unprecedented. Our xenobiologists are calling it impossible. Your xenobiologists need to get out more, Patricia replied. What you saw wasn't impossible. It was just recognition. They recognized that I wasn't a threat, that I understood what they were trying to do, and that I could help them do it better. But how? Ambassador Velthar's voice cracked slightly. How did they know to trust you? Patricia was quiet for a moment, watching the cubs play. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. Because humans understand what it's like to be misunderstood, she said simply. We know what it's like to have everyone assume the worst about you, to be seen as primitive or dangerous or irrelevant. And we know what it's like to do the right thing, even when nobody appreciates it. She stood up, gathering her things with the same casual efficiency she'd shown throughout this entire impossible situation. The Shadowhunters aren't monsters. They're just people. Different kind of people, but people nonetheless. They love their families. They protect their communities. And they try to do right by those who can't protect themselves. Sound familiar? The assembled aliens exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both understanding and a growing sense of unease about what this might mean for their carefully ordered galaxy. Dr. Williams, Empress Kythera's psychic voice was softer now, touched with something that might have been gratitude. What you have done today, how can we repay such a debt? Patricia shouldered her backpack and headed for the door, pausing only to scratch one of the cubs behind its ear ridges. Just remember what you learned today, she said. Sometimes the scariest-looking people are just trying to help. Sometimes the most primitive solutions are the most effective. And sometimes, when everyone else is preparing for war, what you really need is someone willing to sit down and have a conversation. She was almost to the door when Ambassador Velthar called after her. Dr. Williams, what happens now? The galaxy will want to know. What changes? Patricia turned back with that same smile she'd worn in the council chambers. the smile of someone who had just realized that the entire galaxy was about to learn something it really should have figured out a long time ago. "Now?" she said. "Now you all get to figure out how many other monsters out there are just misunderstood parents trying to do their best. Should be fun." The door slid shut behind her, leaving the most powerful beings in the galaxy to contemplate a universe that had suddenly become much more complicated and infinitely more interesting. 3 days later, the Galactic Council received the first of what would become known as the Shadowhunter reports. Detailed communications from Shadowhunter packs across 17 sectors, all requesting formal diplomatic contact and offering their services as interspecies childcare specialists and conflict resolution consultants. The reports were delivered by courier, along with a handwritten note from Dr. Patricia Williams that read, "Told you so. Also, you're going to need a lot more tennis balls. PW." At the bottom of the note, in smaller text, was an addendum that would become legendary throughout the galaxy. "P.S. Next time you have an interspecies crisis, maybe try asking the humans first. We're surprisingly good at this sort of thing." The Galactic Council voted unanimously to establish the first-ever human diplomatic corps, specializing in impossible situations and monster relations. They also voted to keep a strategic reserve of tennis balls, squeaky toys, and coffee, just in case. Because if there was one thing the galaxy had learned, it was that humans had a disturbing tendency to make the impossible look routine, usually while making sarcastic observations about everyone else's complete failure to grasp the obvious. And somewhere in the sacred grove of eternal whispers, a pack of Shadowhunters played fetch with a collection of Earth toys, teaching their cubs the most important lesson in the universe. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places, delivered by the most unlikely heroes. Even if those heroes did insist on making everyone else feel slightly stupid in the process. 6 months after what historians would later call the tennis ball incident, Patricia Williams found herself back in the Galactic Council chambers, though this time the circumstances were considerably different. Instead of sitting in the primitive species observer section, she now occupied a chair at the main diplomatic table, complete with her own nameplate that read, "Dr. Patricia Williams, Director of Interspecies Relations," in 17 different languages. The irony was not lost on her. "Dr. Williams," began Ambassador Velthar. His crystalline structure, now permanently tinted with what Patricia had learned, was the color of chronic bewilderment. "We have another situation." "Let me guess," Patricia said, not looking up from the report she was reading. "Someone discovered another monster species that's actually just trying to help. Everyone panicked, and now you need the primitive human to sort it out?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "The void devourers of the Omega Nebula have emerged from their dimensional pocket," Fleet Commander Zexthul reported with the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. They're systematically consuming entire star systems." Patricia finally looked up from her report, raising an eyebrow that had become famous throughout the galaxy for its ability to convey profound skepticism with minimal effort. "Consuming how exactly?" "They appear to be eating the stellar matter," the fleet commander continued. "Whole stars gone. Planets, asteroids, space debris, everything. And the assumption is that they're destroying these systems? What else could they be doing?" Ambassador Velthar's voice cracked with exasperation. "They're called void devourers. They devour things." Patricia set down her report and pulled out her tablet, the same ordinary Earth tablet that had somehow become the most feared piece of technology in the galaxy, primarily because it usually preceded someone's worldview being completely demolished. "Have you tried asking them why they're doing it?" The assembled delegates exchanged the kind of looks usually reserved for moments when someone suggests something so obvious that everyone feels stupid for not thinking of it first. They don't communicate," stammered the Florian representative, whose leaves were already starting to wilt in anticipation of another paradigm-shifting revelation. "They exist in dimensional space that our technology can't penetrate." "So you haven't actually tried talking to them," Patricia clarified. "How does one communicate with beings of pure energy who exist outside normal space-time?" demanded the mechanoid delegate. Patricia stood up, shouldering her backpack with the same casual efficiency that had become her trademark. "Same way you communicate with anyone else. You figure out what language they speak and you use it. Dr. Williams, Ambassador Velthar's voice carried a note of desperation. These beings could destroy the entire galaxy. We cannot simply assume they're misunderstood like the Shadowhunters. Can't we? Patricia was already heading for the door. Tell me, what happened to all that stellar matter they consumed? Did it just disappear? Or did something else happen? The fleet commander consulted his datapad. Well, the energy signatures suggest the matter was converted to… Wait. His mechanical voice processing unit actually stuttered. The matter appears to have been converted to stable fusion reactions and redistributed to dying star systems in adjacent sectors. Patricia paused at the door, her hand on the controls, wearing that smile again. So let me get this straight. The Void Devourers are taking matter from dead or dying systems and using it to revitalize failing stars in other sectors. They're basically cosmic recyclers, preventing stellar collapse and extending the life of entire civilizations. The silence that followed was so profound, it seemed to have its own gravitational field. But they're called Void Devourers, whispered the Florian delegate. Yeah, well, humans are called primitive bipeds. And look how that turned out, Patricia replied. Maybe it's time to stop judging species by their names and start paying attention to their actions. She activated the door controls, then turned back one more time. Also, you might want to consider the possibility that they've been trying to help for centuries, but nobody bothered to say thank you. In my experience, that tends to make people a bit antisocial. As the door slid shut behind her, the Galactic Council sat in stunned silence, contemplating a universe where the most terrifying beings might actually be the galaxy's unsung heroes, working tirelessly to prevent cosmic catastrophe while being branded as monsters by the very civilizations they were trying to save. 3 hours later, Patricia Williams became the first being in galactic history to successfully establish diplomatic contact with entities existing in dimensional space. Using a combination of mathematical equations, interpretive dance, and what she later described as basic courtesy. The Void Devourers, it turned out, had been wondering for millennia why nobody ever said thank you for all their hard work keeping the galaxy from collapsing into entropic decay. They were also surprisingly fond of Earth music, particularly jazz.